When you come to think of it, almost all human behavior and activity is not essentially any different from animal behavior. The most advanced technologies and craftsmanship bring us, at best, up to the super chimpanzee level. Actually, the gap between, say, Plato or Nietzsche and the average human is greater than the gap between that chimpanzee and the average human. The realm of the real spirit, the true artist, the saint, the philosopher, is rarely achieved. Why so few? Why is world history and evolution not stories of progress, but rather this endless and futile addition of zeros? No greater values have developed. Hell, the Greeks, 3,000 years ago, were just as advanced as we are. So what are these barriers that keep people from reaching anywhere near their real potential? The answer to that can be found in another question, and that's this. Which is the most universal human characteristic? Fear or laziness?
He was sent by his Father from the heavens to save humanity from itself. He is not of this world, yet he is both man and God. His last name means Lord, yet he goes by many names. He was killed and resurrected. His strength comes from being a solar logos. No, my beloved true seekers, it ain't Jesus or any of the other dying, rising godmen of antiquity. He's actually a later avatar, and his name is Superman, or Kal-El.
Look, shut up. I'm speaking rhetorically.
Robert Price has noted this obvious Christian soteriology of our modern times, and so does our astral guest, Christopher Knowles, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his seminal book, Our Gods Wear Spandex. You'll never look at comic books the same way, unless you whack off to Wonder Woman, Starfire, or the Scarlet Witch. For comic books are brainiacs, full of the wisdom of the ages and the wisdom of the ancient mysteries. Even Batman and Robin, or as my gay friends like to say, Buttman and Throbbin.
Ha, ha, ooh, hee, ha, ha, and I thought my jokes were bad.
But first my introduction, which will make you wish you were in a bathroom stall next to the Hulk after I'm done.
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
Aeon, Byte, Gnostic Radio, broadcast through thegodabovegod.com, and formerly known as Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, or Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis. I named it that in the beginning because I believe the Gnostics, besides being history's first deconstructionists, sci-fi karate masters, and on-the-money conspiracy theorists, were one of the first politically incorrect pundits. And political incorrectness is one of the ways to shatter the mind-forged manacles of Jehovah and neuter the granola Tinkerbell followers of Gaia, who don't understand that she hates humanity as much as the Archons.
Brother, life's a bitch. She's back in heat.
What they take as nature is not nature, but raped, subjugated, and manicured nature. One day when I am ruler of this cosmos and dress like Emperor Ming and have my own Queen soundtrack, I will drop neo-pagans in the middle of African jungles or Arab deserts and see how nurturing and compassionate Gaia truly is when we haven't tamed her. She's as vicious as an investment banker and as cruel as Hera when Uncle Flo makes his monthly visit.
Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something.
And then it became Aeon, Byte, Gnostic Radio, because reality bites, and it's time that we spiritual truth seekers bite back. In cyberspace and in the so-called real world, against the Somali pirate establishment that has kept us on a steady diet of bigotry, consumerism, and misinformation for so many lifetimes.
I want peace on earth and goodwill toward men.
We are the United States government. We don't do that sort of thing.
Aeon Byte doesn't take prisoners but liberates them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything, especially being a lighthouse or a watchtower for all you jokers and thieves out there to find the path that works for you and only you. Like Joseph Campbell once said, we must be willing to let go of the life we plan so as to have the life that is waiting for us.
What's the journey I have to make, you have to make, each of us has to make? You talk about something called the soul's high adventure.
Follow your bliss.
We are not against any ideology or creed, but the fascist kind that poison the heart and sell our chakras on eBay, as well as the many New Age Kool-Aid stands selling the elixir of ignorance that turn us into shambling zombies who wander about with our wallets out. These religious and spiritual descended masters, who in addition give us watered down advice because secretly they want us to be as average as they are, except they've found one idea and milked it. Kinda like Lucy playing shrink in Peanuts.
They'll fix you. They fix everything.
And you are the Gnostics, the lovers of the esoterica and the Dionysian freethinkers. You are the revenge of the myth, the lords of deconstruction, and the word made on flesh. You are the allogenes, or strangers of this cosmos, the outcast Peter Parker. You are the indomitable race of Seth, the first Gnostic. Mutants, always hiding, even as you save others in your yellow spandex mentality. You are scorned as you fight the gods themselves, just like Thor and Wonder Woman have been doing for generations.
God will have his vengeance.
I think your God is afraid of me.
Welcome to the revolution of the mind and the spigot, aeons in the making, in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria. We don't occupy Wall Street, but occupy heaven and hell and all the farthest corners of creation with the awakening song of Hagia Sophia. And I am your Professor X, Watcher, or Silver Surfer, taking you on a dark odyssey on the seas of fate through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy, all the way to the farthest shores of imagination. I am Abraxas. And yes, Abraxas is also a comic book character who appeared in the Fantastic Four, so powerful he even killed one of the Demiurge's shills, Galactus. His purpose was to destroy and devour all the dimensions in the multiverse, so he's a bit of a douchebag.
I mean, think about it. He's a lawyer and a supervillain. It's like a shark with a grenade launcher on his head.
Of course, in the end, the Fantastic Four figure out a way to defeat this Abraxas and save reality. Stupid smartass Reed Richards. How they portray you in the Venture Brothers is really who you are. And you probably believe in global warming, genetically modified food, and fluoride water. But this vanquished Abraxas comes to you in his mortal incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world. And yes, I do smoke and eat meat. But at least I don't kill poor animals in the wild, but get my meat from the grocery store, where no animals are ever harmed, such is my wisdom and kindness.
It doesn't make any sense. Any fucking sense.
As mentioned at the beginning of this program, before you began using Wolverine's claws to shave your pubes, our guest is Christopher Knowles, who discusses his groundbreaking book, Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Comic Books. And what a game changer it is, my beloved Truth Seekers. As much of a game changer as when Chris joined us on Aeon Byte 180, Rock Music as a Mystery Religion, to inform us on his likewise groundbreaking book, The Secret History of Rock and Roll. Similar themes, but once the leap of faith rubber meets the heretical road, a different kind of gnosis. And to find out more about Chris, please visit his mind-billowing and spiritual vagina-fingering blog, secretsun.blogspot.com. Chris has an array of provocative, insightful, and radioactive articles on ancient and modern culture. He's an unparalleled social philosopher and Captain America of the esoterica. In fact, I'm surprised the infernal bridal chamber of government and big business hasn't put him in a source code compartment by now.
Source code is not time travel. Rather, source code is time reassignment.
Comic books have fascinated and inspired people of all ages for generations. Yet few know that its heroes and themes were heavily influenced by the occult revival of the 19th and early 20th century, and that its esoteric undertones continue to this day, especially with the runic touch of such openly magician artists as Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Jack Kirby, Neil Gaiman, and many more. To wit, instead of looking at the past to old gods, mythological heroes, and arcane saviors, comic books secretly bring these luminaries and place them in modern times to deal with modern problems, and often timeless problems.
The world will look up and shout, "Save us." And I'll whisper, "No."
In our interview and Our Gods Wear Spandex, Chris takes us on a journey from the genesis of comic books, its evolution and that of its mystic protagonists, to our age where their heretical message is more salient than ever before because of movies and video games.
The comic books had it wrong. It didn't take a trauma, or cosmic rays, or a power ring to make a superhero. Just the perfect combination of optimism and naivety.
Could the solution to so many of our spiritual and material problems be right in front of us, dressed in tights? I have no doubt, my beloved Truth Seekers.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
And of course, we should mention other influences, like eugenics and fascism, believe it or not. Or more like believe it, because the two have always been part of the occult. Chris even posits that Batman is just our insane, totalitarian shadow run amok, among other heroes.
Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Chris also writes about Edward Bulwer Lytton, an author in the early 19th century that many consider the father of science fiction. His novel Vril concerns a race of superhuman beings that live underground in a shadowy utopia, preparing one day to take over the iPad-worshipping monkeys on the surface. Many say this was the foundation of the notion of the master race, or Uberman, that became endemic to theosophy, Nazism, communism, and other dark movements.
You see, none of it was real. It was illusion. Your art, your science, it was all a nightmare. Now it's done. Finished.
On one hand, it is patently racist. On the other hand, it's about separating yourself from the average and going all the way to make a difference. On both hands, this Magneto ideal has been warped and has been one of the great Dr. Dooms of individuality. And many comic book authors have been proponents of it.
We are the future, Charles, not them. They no longer matter.
Oh, and Bulwer Lytton is famous for one of the best and one of the worst quotes ever written. One is, "It was a dark and stormy night." The other is, "The pen is mightier than the sword." Chris, of course, details a whole Justice League of characters that indirectly and directly influence the comic book superhero archetype. And those include Aleister Crowley, Harry Houdini, H.P. Lovecraft, Arthur Conan Doyle, Jules Verne, and many more. Our Gods Wear Spandex details all the tributaries that went into comic book superhero DNA beyond classic paganism and mystery school ethos. This book is exhaustive, except maybe mentioning Gnostic-themed comics.
My God, not everything's about you and your little job and your little world.
I think I can safely put Grant Morrison's The Invisibles in that category, although it's more of a mixture of Manichaean and Philip K. Dick speculation. Alan Moore plucks the hermetic chords with his series Promethea, and Neil Gaiman hits the Gnostic notes here and there in his Sandman series, and certainly gets Jungian in his movie Mirror Mask. That's about it, except for a few themes and episodes and different titles. In his book, The Serpent's Gift, Jeff Kripal puts forth a convincing argument that the X-Men are an allegory for the classic Gnostics. You know, elite, gifted, hiding their secrets, a threat to an orthodox society, and so forth.
You actually go outside in these things?
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Ironically, there is more Gnosticism in Japanese anime and video games. Check out my article, Do Gnostics Dream of Giant Robots, in the Gnostic Journal number 3, or right at this website. Other than that, here comes a speech that will make you want to swallow the tampon of She-Hulk.
Come on, kill me, I'm here! Come on, do it now, kill me!
Any type of assistance is always a blessing, even if it's the many skills I don't have. Your support is essential for Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Bless you human torches that have supported this Aquaman venture via donations, buying products, or downloading shows. I've really had some Dark Phoenix aid recently, and I can't begin to thank you enough. But more help is necessary if this venture is to continue at the graphic novel level. If everyone simply donates a shekel or buys a show every week, I can break even and even reinvest in the show, as well as bankroll a reboot of the greatest American hero franchise.
A world of pain.
And please, spread the blasphemous word to anyone seeking the road less traveled or the highway to hell. But enough of my drivel. Let's put on Thor's jockstrap or Elektra's thong and enter into a secret world of gnosis. From Chris Knowles, Our Gods Wear Spandex. And why? Well, as Chris writes towards the end of his work, superheroes provide escape, but from what and to where? From the mind-numbing mediocrity of most modern life, to a space where greater potentials and possibilities exist.
I feel like I was meant for something more than this. I want to do something with my life.
I want to be somebody.
But it's no longer enough for us simply to root for these heroes. Deep down, we want to become them. This is the impulse behind the role-playing popular today at comic conventions, in which fans dress like their favorite characters and act out their adventures. Costume contests are also popular, and some fans write reverent parodies of their gods or make home videos based on their favorite characters. The same impulse is driving the increasing popularity of Halloween with adults.
It's Halloween, and as much fun as it is, it can also be very dangerous. You see, with all you kids running around wearing dark clothing and monster and devil masks that cover your whole face, you all run into a serious risk of becoming devil worshippers, or even Buddhists.
People want to enter into the mythic realm and become someone else in an attempt to shed their mundane problems. This phenomenon is a survival of the mystery cults of ancient times, with their rituals and festivals in which pagans dressed like their favorite gods and acted out their dramas. Sounds a lot like we're all about here at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio at the virtual Alexandria. This is Saturday, October 8th, the year of our demiurge, 2011.
Unlike the classical heroes, we're not going on our journey to save the world, but to save ourselves.
And in doing that, you save the world. I mean, you do. The influence of a vital person vitalizes. There's no doubt about it. The world is a wasteland. People have the notion of saving the world by shifting it around and changing the rules. No, any world is a living world if it's alive. And the thing is to bring it to life. And the way to bring it to life is to find in your own case where your life is and be alive yourself, it seems to me.
With great power comes great responsibility.
This is the Aeon Byte interview. And with us we have the pleasure of being joined again by Chris Knowles to discuss his book, Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Comic Book Heroes. How are you doing today, Chris?
Doing good.
Well, thank you again for joining us. Most people probably believe that comics just sprang up from the ground as a new medium. You know, one day suddenly there was Superman with throwing a car one day, and that was it. But as you reveal in your book, there was a certain charged atmosphere in the 19th and early 20th century that reinvented the gods and mythological heroes we loved into contemporary settings. This was a precursor to the comic book hero. Could you tell us some of the reasons for this consciousness shift?
Well, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about comics and the comic book form is that there's always been this really interesting connection to esoterica and strangeness and weird connections to secret societies and all this crazy stuff. If you really look back in history, I think that you could make a good argument that, you know, the comic book form in some regard could be seen in Egyptian hieroglyphics, in sort of illuminated manuscripts, Bayeux Tapestry, the story of the Norman invasion of England. And I did a lot of work on the Normans recently on the blog vis-a-vis the Templars and that whole history, which is fascinating. But one of the things that's really interesting, there's actually a book, big coffee table book that you could get at your library or through interlibrary loan called Early Comic Books. And this goes back to like the Renaissance. And one of the earliest examples of a comic book as we know it was called the Mutus Liber, and it was an alchemical text. It was like an alchemical instructional text. So, you know, we're talking about like esotericism is basically instilled into the DNA. I mean, of course, this would horrify, 95% of most comic fans today who are, reductionist materialists and nihilists and all that good stuff, or bad stuff. And The Amazing Randy, which a lot of people will know what that all entails, is a big hit at the conventions, this whole sort of pseudo-skepticism thing. But, the whole idea of superheroes and everything like this goes right back to the ancient gods and the ancient heroes. And a lot of people have argued that hero, the word hero, comes from Heru or Horus, and a lot of the heroes themselves, the Greek concept of the hero is very much in line with the Osiris mythos. And don't forget that around the age of Alexander, that Isis became a major figure in Greece and sort of brought her, and the entire Hellenistic world, and sort of brought her mythos with her. So Heru, Horus, Hercules, Heracles, another name that's derived from Horus. Hercules is a fascinating character in so many different ways, and a character that we sort of wonder why he sort of sticks around and why he continues to resonate. And I think that the true nature of Hercules, who, by the way, is still a major comic book hero today. I mean, there are several different, or there were up until very recently, several different Hercules comic book titles. But Hercules was, people who are interested in alchemy will know that Hercules was a major figure in alchemy. He was a major figure in the Renaissance. He became the patron saint of Florence, Italy, but he was also known to the Gnostics. There was a Gnostic vision of Hercules. And Hercules, what he is, and how this really ties into the superhero today, is that he is not only a savior figure, a solar savior figure, and that the alchemists in particular identified him with the sun, but he is also an intermediary between man and the gods, that he is a demigod who makes the path for humanity to sort of thrive and prosper in this horrible planet that we live on. And I think that these things are all like ingrained in the DNA. And I think what really happened is that we had this experiment where a group of aristocrats decided that there would be a new global religion that would incorporate paganism and Judaism and Platonic philosophy into a one-world religion, which became Christianity. And a lot of this stuff was sort of shunted to the side for not that long a period of time as we might think. But the gods and the archetypes really made a huge comeback in the High Middle Ages and into the Renaissance period. And what we saw in the 19th century, and this is really the crux of the book, sort of the turning point, is we saw the neoclassical movement, and we also saw the occult revival, we saw Rosicrucian revival, we saw Freemasonry, we saw Theosophy, which was sort of this very dodgy attempt to, I guess, corporatize the spiritualist movement, which had all these interesting spiritual dissenters and groups and things like that. And you can very much see Theosophy as this attempt, this very deliberate attempt in some ways to bring all this into a predictable and organized system. But what happened is that a lot of these really, the true occult, I mean, there is no occult anymore. Everything, the occult really referred to this body of knowledge that had been suppressed, that had been hidden during the Inquisitions, during the Reformation, during the Counter-Reformation, all the religious wars and whatnot. And the whole idea of the occult was reviving these forms of ancient wisdom. But what had happened, and what happens so often, is that all the prohibition and shaming of the occult sciences gave it this very rebellious and mysterious allure. I'm not really sure if they deserve in a lot of ways, but a lot of it was the forbidden aspect of this. And this entered into the pop culture. We saw it come in with the Theosophists, who had these massive printing presses, They had their own publishing houses. But also these other groups, and certainly the occult groups like the Golden Dawn and some of these other offshoots of that all these ideas that would show up in what were called the pulps. And the pulp magazines are the direct precursors to the comic books. The pulp magazines were not in the comic book format, but it was the same subject matters, the same stories. You had basically superheroes. The difference is that they didn't wear costumes as, we would recognize them. Superman, the tights, which were all based on circus strongman costumes. But, the Shadow, Doc Savage, the Avenger, and there were a number of characters that became the prototypes for the superheroes. I mean, the Shadow was basically, well, let's just say, ripped off to create Batman. And Doc Savage was certainly, there's actually elements of Doc Savage in Batman, but also in Superman. For instance, like the Fortress of Solitude came from Doc Savage. And he was called the Superman. So what really happened is that you had this process where a lot of this ancient mythology and lore became popularized again through the occult revival, through these mystical groups, and that filter, that trickled down, for lack of a better term, into the pulps. Because the pulp heroes all got their powers through mystical means. They all traveled to Tibet or to the Orient, to the Himalayas, wherever, to meet with basically the secret chiefs or the Great White Brotherhood, just pulpy Pulp Fiction versions of that whole archetype, from Blavatsky and people like that. And they were given these superpowers that they used to come back and fight, which was, a huge concern to the middle classes in particular, that there were these huge waves of immigration from Southern Europe, and there was a tremendous amount of unrest and crime, and people like Lovecraft. A great example is the horror at Red Hook. Is how the native-born population sort of perceived this what they saw as an onslaught. So the pulp heroes were sort of summoned from the collective unconscious to battle this chaos, the mobs, prohibition, all this sort of thing. So really what it was this evolution. And I think in a lot of ways that our pop culture, even as it exists today, is still mining this explosion in the 19th century. And, it's one of the things that I'm really fascinated by is how, Mormonism, for example, was also a product of what they called the burnt over district in New York, this sort of heterodox, spiritual, experimental wave. I think they're probably the only group to survive from that. You also had Christian Science, but I think that they're pretty much almost done. But the Mormons have produced a lot of like science fiction writers and superhero writers and all this sort of stuff, because it seems to be that pulpy mythic element is sort of hardwired into that religion as well.
Yeah, and also, like you point out in your book, there's been a lot of Jewish comic book writers because of the persecution they had to go through.
What that had a lot to do with is that during the early 20th century, when you had these massive waves of immigration from Eastern Europe into America, into New York, is that you had a lot of people whose parents, if not they themselves, were sort of fleeing like the pogroms and the sort of the ferment, the political ferment that led up to World War I and the Russian Revolution and things like that. That there was this wave of refugees from that political violence that produced a lot of anti-Semitism. So I think that pop culture, American pop culture, was like such a beacon to so many. It was just manna from heaven to any kid from whatever background. And I think a lot of these Jewish kids, and there were also a lot of Italian kids as well, that they really gravitated towards this because it was the only culture that they had really available. You know, one of the people who I really focus on in the book, Jack Kirby, talked about how he would go picking through the garbage to find old pulp magazines and old Sunday comic supplements and things like that, you know, because his parents couldn't afford, you know, to buy the books and such. But this was really it was an amazing assimilating tool in a lot of ways, because the comic strips were so incredibly popular, and this is back in the day where every Sunday supplements, Flash Gordon, Prince Valiant, you know, whoever these heroes were that the kids were reading, it was a full page, and it was all hand engraved. I mean, this stuff was gorgeous. Beautiful artwork, full page, full color. I mean, it was basically like sort of the IMAX 3D of its time. And this was a new technology, color printing, cheap, available color printing, you know, not very expensive and sort of reserved for the elite as it was in the 19th century. This was a new technology that was cheap and readily available, and just really impressive, because this is at a time when art schools really taught you how to draw, and the work was just stunning. And again, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I mean, take a film like Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars really is the ultimate sort of expression of this process from that little explosion. Because, I mean, really what Star Wars is that it's Flash Gordon meets Buck Rogers, and then a whole bunch of other sort of more exotic elements thrown in. But, you know, really the core of it comes from the Sunday Funnies, which...
As you mentioned, Chris, George Lucas was just as influenced by Jack Kirby as he was by Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, you know, I always felt like his Joseph Campbell fixation was kind of retroactive, that he stole so many elements from Kirby. And this is also something that I covered pretty extensively on the blog. He stole so much from Jack Kirby that he sort of had to find a way to, I don't know, cover his ass in some ways.
Exactly. Make it more legitimate.
Yeah, sort of give this a patina of legitimacy, I guess. I mean, it was pretty blatant. And, you know, Kirby was always a guy who really sweated it whenever his work was sort of borrowed, for lack of a better term, because he lived and breathed that stuff. It was his life's work. And, you know, this is at a time before you could make $1 million, you know, if your graphic novel was made into a movie or whatever. You know, this is a time when comic book artists would often not tell their neighbors what they did for a living, because during the 50s there was this huge backlash against and a backlash that I think had a lot more justification than people give it credit for, because there was a lot of garbage that was being aimed at kids, some really extreme material that was being aimed at very young children. No matter what sort of this revisionist history you read about it, there's this sort of persecution complex wired into the comic book mentality from this guy named Frederick Wortham, who wrote this book called Seduction of the Innocent. And he sort of detailed how these comics were really just filled with a lot of sexual innuendo and subliminals and really excessive gore and violence and things like this. But, you know, Wortham was attacking this material from the left. You know, Wortham was a refugee, a Jewish refugee from Germany, and he saw comic books as conditioning kids for fascism. He saw superheroes, you know, as basically the sort of Nietzschean Ubermenschen archetype that was, you know, in combination with all the sex and violence. Yeah, exactly. That he sort of saw that this was leading, you know, it was sort of like a Weimar vibe that he was getting all this stuff. So I think that he is very unjustly maligned, and it's, you know, it should be noted, this is always sort of excised from the from the history is that, when you had like Lee and Kirby and the whole Marvel explosion and things like that, Wortham really came around and he saw the value in this stuff, that his whole way of thinking had evolved as comics themselves had evolved. And I think, particularly Stan Lee and his just love of Shakespeare and language and things like that really elevated the medium, and certainly Kirby played a major part in that as well. And the fact that Lee really tried to put a lot of what he called relevance, that the stories were relevant to what was happening in the 60s, and a lot of that sort of got really ridiculous in some ways, but it was all brand new. Comics were no longer just about throwaway punch 'em ups, 8-page punch 'em ups.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you talk about how the occult and the esoteric and radical ideas influence comic books as part of their DNA, like you said. But in our modern day, some of the great luminaries themselves are pretty much out of the closet occultists, like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. Neil Gaiman is definitely an expert, and Kirby knew his esoterica very well. They're not ashamed, and they like being occultists.
Well, the guy who really started that and doesn't really get the credit for it is this guy named Steve Englehart. And Steve Englehart is a guy who came up through the 70s, started working for Marvel, was writing books like The Avengers and Captain Marvel, but also did a run on Doctor Strange where, he had, the Rosicrucians and the Hellfire Club and all these sort of things. Doctor Strange traveling back in time to the Revolutionary era and the Freemasons and all this sort of thing. He's really the guy, more than anyone. You saw some of this material, I guess, maybe in some of the European comics and perhaps in maybe a few undergrounds here and there. But Steve Englehart, I don't think gets enough credit for being the guy who breached that wall, who really reached back into a lot of these antecedents that, I guess guys like Moore and Morrison are more identified with these days. They're really, in a lot of ways, building on what he did. But there's also, a guy who I didn't write about in the book per se, but sort of brought like this very psychedelic, cosmic vision, very heavily inspired by Kirby, was this guy named Jim Starlin, who did a book called Warlock. He did Captain Marvel, Dreadstar, some other series. And his history is really interesting because he went to Vietnam, and he was, I think he was involved in map making or something, but he was out in the field surveying, so he saw a lot of the carnage firsthand, and it really shook him up. So his work, when he started working for Marvel in the 70s, was very, it was almost Manichaean, it was very much a light cosmic versus dark cosmic struggle, with these death-worshipping tyrants and all this crazy stuff. A lot of it was, being lifted from Kirby at the same time, but he was definitely bringing a much more psychedelic, hallucinogenic take. And then there's also a guy named Barry Smith. I think he did work with Steve Englehart on at least one issue of Doctor Strange, I believe. Maybe it was Roy Thomas, I'm not sure. But he was very much involved in these sort of mystical, experiential things. So much of the stuff was a lot more, I don't necessarily want to say respectable, but it was certainly a lot more accepted by the fans than it is today. And again, the fans today are very nihilistic, sort of see themselves. I guess they're all brainwashed by Bill Nye the Science Guy or something, I'm not sure. But it's interesting in a lot of ways to me because, you can point to guys like Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore and maybe Warren Ellis, but they're tolerated. It's like they're so talented and whatnot that it's all these indulgences are sort of tolerated by the fans, but it's not as if they're leading this vanguard that the fandom is just rife with mystics.
Yeah, they're not as good a recruiting tool as Harry Potter or
not even close.
Or Buffy the Vampire Slayer or something like that.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. I mean, because really, it's such a strange period in a lot of ways. Because one thing that I when I was originally doing all the interviews for this book, I was telling people that you really have to almost separate superheroes and comics now. That superheroes are going to be much more about the movies and the video games, and that the comics are almost going to be sort of this ancillary thing, and that comics themselves are going to be migrating more and more to online, the web and whatnot, and will probably be much different in story and in subject matter than just superhero punch 'em ups. I think there's going to be this very powerful drift. I mean, right now, the big story in comics right now is that DC basically rebooted their entire line from the ground up. They canceled all their books and started them, not all of them, but a number of different series at issue number 1. And what they're doing now is they're doing what's called day and date. And day and date means that at the same time they're publishing the floppies, the little 32-page pamphlets, they're putting the stories online that you can buy the comic to read online, particularly for your iPad and things like that. Because what has happened is that the readership didn't refresh itself. That there was this huge influx of readers in the 80s. Teenage boys. A lot of it had to do with the Star Wars comic. They were very, the Star Wars comics were very popular, and the G.I. Joe comic was very popular. So these toy tie-ins and these movie tie-ins brought a huge influx of fans in, not maybe as much as had been reading them in the 60s, certainly, or definitely not even in the 40s. But there was this new generation of fans that sort of came of age in the late 70s and the early 80s. And then you sort of had a very temporary wave in the early 90s, but none of the kids who sort of were brought into comics because of the X-Men cartoon, which was hugely popular in the early 90s, none of them stuck around. They all abandoned, and 99% basically did not stick around. They abandoned the medium for video games and the internet. So really the core audience right now of superhero comic books are middle-aged men who grew up reading the material. It's a very expensive hobby to pursue, when a 32-page story
it is.
Cost you $3 or $4 or $5. And for a while there was this trend called decompressed storytelling, and basically what decompressed storytelling was making comics read like movies, because all these guys wanted to work in Hollywood, so they just wanted the comics to be very easily understood by movie producers. But what happened is that you'd buy a comic for $3 or $3.50 or whatever, and it would take you 5 minutes to read, because it just basically was page upon page storyboards with little
Michael Bay scene or something.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I still don't understand it. It still doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe I'm not the target audience. I don't know, but I think it did I think it drove a lot of fans away, because you really weren't getting money for value for money. You were not getting value for money when you were spending $3.50, $4 for something that took you 5 or 10 minutes to read. And certainly you're not going to bring in anyone who's not already addicted that way. So I think that what they're doing now, all the major companies makes a lot of sense. That they see the internet and iPads and doing comic books for 4G phones and stuff as being the next newsstand. I'm not exactly sure how this will appeal to a new generation of fans. I mean, I certainly hope it does, but I think the jury's definitely out on who is buying this, whether it's just the already committed fans, sort of this core of, maybe a little less than 100,000 middle-aged men who will spend $50 to $100 a month on comic books, because that's basically the core of the audience right now.
And Chris, since it's the theme of the show, I do have to ask you this: what are some Gnostic-themed comic book series out there, in your opinion?
That's a good question.
For me, obviously the Grant Morrison, the Invisibles, but it's more Manichaean. I guess Alan Moore, Promethea is more hermetic.
Yeah, it's hard to say, because I'm not quite sure that there is a Gnostic narrative in comics as there is, say, in like Cyberpunk, the William Gibson novels, or in the Matrix films, or in movies like Dark City. I suppose the Invisibles. Now, for people who aren't familiar with the series, the Invisibles was this series about these this group of occultists who are fighting this alien elite sort of New World Order kind of conspiracy. And that's very roughly put, because, the story in so many different ways was whatever Grant Morrison wanted to write about that particular month. And I mean that in a good way, by the way. As far as Gnostic per se, I'm not actually sure that there is a Gnostic tradition as far as maybe what we would understand as Valentinian Gnostic or Orphite Gnostic. Comic books are more pagan. It's much more of a sort of the Mithraic, Horus, solar Superman, solar savior, Hercules kind of archetype. I think they're much more optimistic than maybe a lot of Gnostic narratives would be per se.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the comic book heroes are here to save us from material things, and that's it. From threats of the world like the old gods were. The weather, evil tribes, and crops, and all that other stuff.
Kirby did this really interesting... actually, Kirby's, I guess, maybe the closest to a Gnostic narrative. Kirby, I think, in a lot of ways, has sort of a very Gnostic mind in many ways, but in many ways it was also very pagan. But he did this really interesting storyline, and I wrote about this on the blog in this book called Devil Dinosaur. Now, Devil Dinosaur was just a pitch for a Saturday morning cartoon that Marvel was starting to expand into animation. They wanted him to come up with ideas for cartoons, so one of them was Devil Dinosaur. Is basically sort of like a Flintstones idea where, cavemen and dinosaurs exist at the same time. But what he did in this series, which is such a strange place to do it, was first of all, Kirby was absolutely fixated on the ancient astronauts. And this was just a very overwhelming obsession with him. So he did this story where this robotic alien race comes down to sort of see what's going on with this ape race and see if they can't be re-engineered to become slaves to this robotic race. And the dinosaurs are sort of rallied by the ape men to sort of fight this alien invasion, and it ends up with basically the story of the Garden of Eden is sort of retold, and that these ape people are, the Adam and Eve, as it were, are kept prisoner by this malfunctioning computer. That's the only thing left from this robotic spaceship, and it's so totally Gnostic. It's like the blind idiot god, the false creator, the false demiurge, and imprisoning Adam and Eve in the garden, and they're ultimately liberated by Devil Dinosaur, who's this this reptile, and
I remember reading that,
the whole idea of the serpent Christ. So it's I don't know if Kirby was reading Gnostic texts at the time, but this whole storyline was just a straight up allegory from Gnosticism. It was really kind of shocking in a lot of ways. The devil, the serpent Christ, is the liberator, and that that God is the insane, malfunctioning computer. But at the same time, he also did this book called The Eternals, and The Eternals again is another ancient astronaut narrative. And this storyline is that mankind and the Earth and all of it was engineered by this giant, the giant robots called the Celestials, and they're basically not necessarily robots. They're pure energy beings who encase themselves in these huge metallic shells to fly around and do their business. And at the same time, they engineered the human race. They engineered this reptilian race called the Deviants, but they also engineered this race of the godlike beings who became the basis for all of mythology, called the Eternals. And the whole storyline, and Kirby had a real hard time. He was great with ideas, but he had a real hard time with follow-through. So the thread of this story got lost, about halfway through the series. But it was this really fascinating, tale where, like, the Eternals and the Deviants, and UFO people familiar with UFO stories will recognize this as the reptilians and the Nordics are battling, control the outcome, and what will happen when the Celestials, these basically the Archons, will judge humanity and how this will all play out. It was a fantastic idea for a series, but I don't know if Kirby really knew what he wanted to say about it. Later on, a few years back, Neil Gaiman did a miniseries based on the original series, but some of the more Gnostic elements were taken out. Gaiman's his outlook is more sort of fantasy oriented, maybe more pagan than Gnostic. I mean, I still enjoyed the series, but it didn't have that thrust that Kirby had with the book before he sort of lost the plot. Kirby was really obsessed, with this whole cosmology, that he was obsessed with the gods. I mean, I think a lot of his fans are embarrassed by this, and a lot of his sort of caretakers, people who were sort of caretaking his legacy, really try to play this down. But I mean, Kirby was full bore into UFOs and all that stuff. I mean, he was a true believer, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that he really had this Gnostic making life experience where he grew up poor on the Lower East Side. As soon as his career was taken off, he was drafted to go fight in Europe. He whatever celebrity he had as a comic book artist didn't matter for anything. He was put on the front lines. When they found out he could draw, they would send him behind enemy lines to sketch out. So basically he was doing reconnaissance, the most dangerous work you could possibly do in the field. And he was only sent back when he came down with such a terrible case of frostbite that both his legs were nearly amputated. And then he came back to the rip-off penny ante business of comic books. So I think that his very pagan Gnostic view of the world really came from hard experience, unlike certainly any of the kids, any of the people who grew up reading him did, unless there were people like Starlin who ended up fighting in Vietnam or whatever.
The Chris, since the publication of Our Gods Wear Spandex, has there been any major seismic shifts in either comic book industry we should know about, or even your views on comic books? I think we were already talking before the interview on Frank Miller going completely right-wing and wanting to kill all the Muslims, but anything else big?
Well, it's I sort of wrote this book at a time when superheroes were really in their ascendancy.
Well, you wrote it before the Wolverine movie. I would love to see your face when you saw it.
Listen, when it comes to superhero movies, I'm usually pretty easy to please in a lot of ways. I'm very forgiving. I mean, I like the Shadow movie. I like the Phantom movie of all things. I think what's happening now is that it's the uptick, that exciting gold rush period is kind of settled into business as usual. That superheroes are very much part of the Hollywood game plan. They make, if the movies are done correctly, they make a lot of money. I think some of the more experimental and left field movies that they made don't do as well. The Watchmen movie was really, it's hard to sell an R-rated superhero movie to the general public. I love the Watchmen movie. I like it better than the comic book, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I liked it too. But 300 was rated R, and it did extremely well.
Well, that wasn't really sold as a superhero movie. I mean, it was in every sense of the word, but it was sort of sold as this, I don't know, just bizarre sword and sorcery movie, I guess. Sort of Conan the Barbarian in some ways. But, of course, Miller tried to sort of follow up with that with The Spirit, which was just a huge bomb. We saw this past year they tried to launch the Green Lantern, and that did very poorly. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that anybody who saw the coming attractions to the Green Lantern movie thought it was coming attractions for a video game. I mean, it just looked like a video. It looked like those theatrical segments in video games. It just didn't work, which is a real shame because I think that Green Lantern is a character that you could have just done straight up as almost like an alien contact movie. Sort of, guy comes in contact with an alien and gets superpowers. I mean, it's sort of a classic narrative. I guess they just couldn't get the tone right. So you have to sort of follow sort of a set formula to be successful with these stories. That movie, Kick-Ass. I mean, I thought that movie was hilarious, but maybe most Americans or most people in general just wouldn't be familiar with the satire. The fact that it was just really poking fun at the medium. That it was very self-satirical. And again, I guess the biggest story this year is DC basically really going full bore with the digital delivery system. I don't know how that's going to play out right now. I mean, so far it's been very successful for them. I mean, they've been doing great business with this relaunch. I'm not exactly sure how we will do in the long term. The comic book market is so artificial in so many ways. It doesn't behave like any other aspect of the publishing industry. It has a sort of its own ecology in a lot of ways. So I'm not really sure what the future really holds. As long as the movies are done well, I think they'll continue to be successful. I think that the archetype itself has always resonated with people. It just needs to be done well. We sort of had a long period, sort of the post-Batman TV show, in which the whole campy thing became really inspired a backlash, let's just say. And of course, the 70s were not really conducive. I think computer graphics and computer animation have really helped to sell the archetype, because before, I mean, if you go back and watch those Superman movies, it's just not exciting at all. It's very, it doesn't have that comic book feeling. It sort of reminds me of maybe the first Star Trek movie in some ways, that the technology hadn't really caught up to the storytelling yet. I don't know what the future of superhero comics is. It's really an open question right now. I think that superheroes themselves are going to continue to resonate, particularly if they're done well. Certainly the Batman movies I don't care for the Batman movies because I think they're just really super right-wing and conservative and stuff. But they've certainly been hugely successful. This year, Thor and Captain America, which were really sort of risks. They were gambles, but they seemed to pay off. So, if superhero movies are done well, they're really exciting action movies with fantasy elements. And I would argue that Avatar is that's a superhero movie. It doesn't really track as such for most people, but it's really Superman in reverse. Instead of Superman coming to our planet and saving us, one of us goes to the alien planet and saves them. You understand what I'm saying? It's
right.
You know what I mean? And it's Clark Kent becomes Superman rather than Superman becomes Clark Kent. So that is a superhero movie. It just wasn't really marketed as one.
Lastly, in our Gods Wear Spandex, you yourself ask, why have comics survived? Why are they still so powerful and influential? What is your answer to this?
Well, my answer would be because when they're done right, they tap into the most ancient storytelling format that we know. The whole idea of the superhero goes all the way back to Gilgamesh, the demigod. It's just something that it's hardwired into us if it's done right and it's done respectfully.
I think you also write, especially during very hard times like the Great Depression, and these days it saves us from being average for a while, doesn't it? It reminds us that we can be more.
Well, it's sort of escapism, it's a very undervalued thing. I think that escapism doesn't get its due. And I always say that the people who I don't trust people who look down on escapism because I always sort of get the sense that they've never had anything bad happen to them. They don't understand the appeal of escape because they've never suffered. And I think that, certainly certain types of intellectual critics and such will look down on escapism. And they'll want to, watch something like The Wire. They want to see, you know what I mean? Like they want to plug themselves into how the other half suffers, and because they've never suffered themselves, they've been coddled and just pampered their entire lives. And I think that's a good way to describe certainly a lot of these critics who come from upper middle class families, go to posh liberal arts schools and get, English lit degrees, and they've never suffered. They don't know what it's like to want to escape. Their escapism, there's a whole generation of kids who escaped into gangster rap and things like that because their lives were so perfect. And I saw this with my older son and his friends. They were growing up in the 90s in a dream world, basically, and they felt inauthentic, so they needed to sort of vicariously live this authentic, quote unquote, authentic life through the gangster rap, which was certainly very popular with these kids, for many years until things got a little more different. You don't want to read about, or you don't want to hear about somebody else's problems when you've got, your own problems to deal with. You want to somehow figure out how to overcome them. And I think that's really what superhero fiction does, is that it writes all these struggles, writ large, and provides this inspirational archetype.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today. Chris, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on again on Aeon Byte and discussing your wonderful book, Our Gods Wear Spandex.
It was fun. I had a lot of thoughts to share since I wrote the book, so I really appreciate this opportunity.
Hey, anytime. It was great talking to you as usual. And have yourself a good day now.
Thanks a lot.